You're done. Well, I'm talking about what Mr. Champagne just did. Okay.
Yeah.
Just don't leave with him.
That's fine. Yes, Judge.
All right. And I forgot my glasses. So let me get those.
I'm going to leave them up there because it makes not mixed in with our stuff.
All right. Let's go on the record just for a second. Did the two of you talk about Mr. Brandie Redwine last night? Is there anything other than changing my ruling that you need to deal with?
No, well, we didn't talk. That wasn't how at least how I understood the intention of the court.
Well, I was certainly hoping you would, and I asked you to. All right, so, all right. Well, I guess we'll just see what happens then if you guys don't know if you're fighting or not.
Judge, I would like to speak on the topic, if you're allowed.
Well, what do you want to tell me?
Judge, I think the court's ruling is correct, and I just wanted to sort of clarify the outlines of what we can expect for cross-examination.
All right.
As I understood the court's ruling yesterday, the narrow range of dates is between the first visit that Brandie Redwine made to the Vallecito area up to...
Or whenever the first talking was about.
Right. Up to and including June 27th, which was the final conversation he described. Defense counsel brought up the rule of completeness yesterday in an attempt to expand the range of dates. It's our position that the rule of completeness applies only to statements that are introduced through the process.
I'm not ruling, I mean, we talked about that, but I'm not ruling on the rule of completeness. I agree with you.
Okay.
This is basically prior inconsistent statements, which would show something different than what was testified.
And I think the court's right on that. The only other testimony outside of those two statements that we introduced, well, there's only two statements. The statement regarding blunt force trauma and the statement regarding Dylan being in my heart. And I know where he is, he's in my heart.
No, I'm not limiting it to that because of your questions that he agreed with that this was a consistent pattern that he didn't care about Dylan. So I'm going to let Mr. Moran go into that. But you're right about the timing. You only talked through the discovery of Dylan's remains, the first discovery. And so that's what I'm going to limit the cost.
Okay. And generally, you're right. I think you're exactly right on that, Judge. I just wanted to...
you know, I need to hear that more often. That's twice in this whole conversation you said that.
Judge, I think if there's testimony that, you know, the defense wants to elicit that can rebut, you know, the demeanor or emotional status of the defendant, that's fine. But I don't think that opens the door to prior inconsistent statements or self-serving hearsay of the defendant to rebut those. That's demeanor and testimony, and it doesn't allow him to simply then go into statements to contradict that.
Well, do I have to go through the hearsay rule with you again?
No, I understand what the court's ruling was on that topic, which is that if it's not being offered for the truth of the matter asserted, it's not hearsay. And statements such as defense counsel presented, and the court pointed out yesterday, I would give my life for Dylan. There's not hearsay in the court's ruling, and I tend to agree, because it's not whether he would actually do that thing. But what I'm concerned about is that defense counsel probably has been, you know, searching the record over the course of the evening and identifying statements that he's going to allege are not hearsay, he's going to present to this jury in the form of this question, and as used the description Mr. Bogan likes to phrase, you can't unscramble that egg once it's already out in front of the jury. And we saw this exact behavior yesterday, which I thought was actually quite disturbing, when Mr. Moran got up, started shaking the binder around, and making statements about how this is being hidden from the jury and they should get to hear the whole story, those types of behaviors. That's totally improper.
Well, that I don't believe happened in front of the jury, and that is improper. However, what you consider hearsay, what Mr. Moran considers hearsay, and what I consider hearsay, I'm sure are three different things.
Exactly.
So we will see what happens with that.
And that's why I would like to hear from defense counsel about his intentions towards introducing any particular statements to contradict the demeanor and emotional state testimony that came out yesterday, because that is extremely damaging to us when the question is even asked in front of the jury without a proper foundation. We've seen that occur several times.
Let me interrupt you.
Thank you.
Exactly why I asked you guys to talk last night. so that we could do this in an efficient manner. This is something that probably should have been done in a pretrial hearing. I know it's a huge case, and I know people are going to miss things. I'm being critical, but I'm really not. I mean, I understand. I've done these cases before. I don't know that that's going to happen. So, Mr. Moran, anything to say?
I mean, it's almost over my head. I'm not sure what you guys are talking about. Yes, I went back and listened to the recording.
Which recording?
Thanks to the wonders of expanded media coverage, I could go watch the entirety of Brandon and Nick Redwine's testimony, Your Honor's ruling. My perception was that Your Honor was saying, well, I know you guys are never going to approve. I don't remember being instructed to talk to opposing counsel. I certainly would have had that been something the court directed in a way that was clear to me. Under 613, I think now that the prosecution has elicited statements of Mr. Redwine, that statements to the contrary of the impression that is misleading that the jury's been left with about Mr. Redwine's reaction to the death of his son and the things that he was saying in phone conversations were totally hamstrung by this ruling and what the prosecution is requesting, because everything that came before June wasn't recorded. So
But you have the statements. They're prior inconsistent statements, just like any prior inconsistent statement that you can cross-examine.
Except that there's no recording of it. There's nothing.
Then how do you know? If you don't, there's no recording of it. There's a written report.
Because
Is there a written report?
Experienced the unfortunate
Is there a
reality.
written report?
There is a report by Investigator Goldbright where she describes in about a paragraph all of the inculpatory statements that Brandon reported to her coming from his father. So based on the repetitiveness of these conversations that I've listened to dozens of hours, I can tell you the substance of the conversations they have repeated over and over again. My take on this is that prior to June, when they were not being recorded, where I do not have transcripts, that those conversations are likely very similar to the ones that came after June, because they're all so repetitive.
Let me interrupt you. I understand what you're saying, though. The scope of these questions were limited in time. The scope of your cross-examination was limited in time. I'm not precluding you from doing anything in the case that you.
I believe that to be not a great use of time, but yes, and I guess the question is if we have to keep recalling these prosecution witnesses, and this is a matter that's left to the sound discretion of the court, whether or not to allow a wider scope on cross-examination, like in an instance like this, where things that happened after June would tell the whole story. But if we're calling these folks in our case, are we going to be allowed to treat them as hostile witnesses?
Of course.
So I guess we'll need a subpoena for Nick Redwine today, but that means we're now up to at least 3 witnesses that are going to have to be recalled because of the limited scope that's been determined based on, I don't know, it just seems like it's not.
Well, if you want me to unlimit the scope, I mean, everybody's complaining about people going outside the scope. I'm going to keep it within the scope. You can decide what you want to do. It'll be at you guys' expense. If there's any expenses for this, it's not going to be on the prosecution's expense. This should be part of your case if you want it. So with that, are we ready to go?
The last thing I think is important to put on the record, just as the court's considering this, is that the question was, quote, during these extended conversations, are you identifying any pattern of topics you would bring up and talk about? I have abundant information about the patterns, and I would request that the court reconsider the limited scope of this testimony. But
I just told you could put it on, but not to your case in chief. What are you complaining about, other than the fact that it's not during cost?
Incurring the cost, the extending the time on this. But if the court's order today is that we can talk about how Mr. Redwine mentioned he loved his son, I can confine it to that.
Okay.
I'm not sure where that is coming. I mean,
I can't decide that because you guys didn't do the pretrial hearing that I could have made a good ruling on this. I mean, I'm in the dark here. You guys have a lot more information than I do, and you're just stuck with it. Okay?
Okay.
All All right. Let's bring up the jury. Hands up. That's the bank record, right?
Yeah. Oh, I've done it. Mm-hmm. Thank you. I learned that lesson. Oh, thank you. I've got that note. Okay, great. All right, we can get it. Okay, Ms. Flann, you want to come back up? And you're still under oath, so have a seat. Whenever you're ready, Mr. Champagne. Oh, no, it's crossed. I'm sorry.
Good morning, Ms. Flann. Welcome back.
Good morning.
If I could ask the prosecution to publish page 1 of 453, I just got some quick questions for you. Can you rotate the view, please? Thank you. Based upon your review of these bank records, you understand that Dylan Redwine and Mr. Mark Redwine opened a joint no-frills checking account, correct?
Correct.
And that was a Pine River Valley Bank, correct? And I just want to hit a few points here. That account was opened on July 31st, 2012, correct?
Correct.
And when someone opens an account, they got to say who they are and what the the main address or addresses for that account, correct?
That's correct.
And the address for this account was 2343 County Road 500, Bayfield, correct?
Correct.
And if we scroll up a little bit, please, down, we can see that the address is in fact 2343 CR 500 Bayfield, correct?
That's correct.
And we also know that when this account was opened, debit card was activated, applied for on that same day, correct?
It was applied for, correct.
Right. And can you walk the jury through what the process was for someone to get a debit card for an account like this circa July 2012?
Sure. At the time of opening, it's on a checking account. We're asked the customer if they want a debit card, and based on the documentation in this case, there was one card issued.
And that documentation, I'm going to ask the people to publish. It's page 5 of the packet, or 18938. Permission to move to the screen for a minute, Jim?
Yes.
Thank you. And page 5 of this packet, it documents what was going on with the debit card in this account, correct?
This page actually documents that there was a card applied for Dylan. Shows the date it was applied for.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And this number here, the and then there's a series of numbers. What's the significance of that?
That is the debit card number.
That's the number that appears on the card.
Correct.
Okay. And the practice would have been open the account, apply for the debit card, and then Pine River Valley Bank had a third-party vendor mail the card, correct?
That's correct.
And that card would have been mailed to the address on the first page of the packet, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Turning your attention to I think it's page 17 of the packet. It's 18949 on the bottom right hand. I'll ask to rotate the view, and I think it's one page previous to that one. So yeah, 18949.
Is the page number in the packet, Council? 17?
I think it's page 17. I can give you the discovery.
Well, this is 17 in the packet, but you have to get the PDF that way for you. Okay. 18949, just pick one up.
You testified about the data on this page yesterday. You remember talking about that?
Yes.
And you specifically talked about some attempts to activate the card, correct?
Correct.
And the card that we're talking about has dates when attempts were made to activate it, and those dates are September 3rd, 2012, correct?
Correct.
And what's the significance of this column of numbers here, the pan and
That's the debit card number.
and that's the same number ending in 32 that we were just talking about moments ago?
Correct.
Okay. And then if we scroll down the document, thank you. there's another series of data regarding or the same series of data regarding debit cards, correct?
Correct.
And it looks like there were attempts to activate a card on September 4th as well, correct?
That's correct.
And the September 4th attempts are on a different card, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Because the September 4th cards end in 812, and the September 3rd cards end in 532. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Nothing further.
Any redirect?
Just briefly, if you could just scroll up one page, page 17. I'm sorry, the other direction. There we go, stop there. And this is the attempt on September 16th, is that correct?
Correct.
And that is ending in card number 32.
Correct.
Okay. It's a little unclear to me. How can there be two different numbers if there was only one card issued? Is there any clarity you can offer?
Based on the document, there was only the one card.
Okay. And that's the documentation that you feel best describes this bank account.
Correct.
And that's back to the beginning there on page, the card maintenance information. Page 5, I believe it was. Page 5.
Correct.
I'm sorry. So close. One more. All right, if you could just scroll up a little bit for me. And as counsel aptly pointed out, on the PAN number, that's, again, ending in number 32, is that correct?
Correct.
And that's the one card that was issued on this account?
Correct.
We can see that here on the next page back, page 4. Is that right? You see that here on this page? Which says card, and it's actually in a blue text box there?
Right.
Is that the number of cards that were issued on this account?
That's correct.
Okay. One card.
One card.
Okay. No further questions.
You should be excused. Oh, jury, I'm sorry. Anything from the jury? Okay, now can you be excused?
By all means.
Mr.
Yes.
Champagne?
Thank you.
You're free to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can we recall Brandon Redwine then?
Yes.
Come on back up, Mr. Redwine. You're still under oath, so just have a seat. Mr. Moran.
Thank you. Mr. Redwine, in November of 2012, you were messaging with Elaine Hall, is that right?
Correct.
And you were saying things to her like, is there anything you want me to try to get out of him, right?
Yes, sir.
And that was with respect to try to get things out of your dad, right?
Correct.
And you were mentioning to her, he seems to want to talk and believe I'm supporting him, right?
Correct.
And what you were suggesting to her is that you were sort of laying in the weeds and trying to get information from him, right?
About Dylan, correct.
There was some discussion about the card that Mark had made up, and at the vigil that happened sometime around June 2012, Mark was giving those cards out at the vigil, right?
Correct.
And that was upsetting to Corey because the cards still said that Dylan was missing on. Correct. And this was right after, like, the day after it became known that Dylan was in fact deceased, right?
Correct.
But what your dad was telling you was that people were asking him for those cards, right?
Correct.
And some of what your testimony was yesterday was that it seemed to you like Mark was just stoic and didn't really seem to care that his child was missing, right?
Correct.
But you would agree that your dad spoke, well, one, that your dad's sort of repetitive, right?
I understand what repetitive is. I'm not sure what you're meaning by that.
That the conversations you had leading up to June 2013 were similar subject matter.
Correct.
The same things came up over and over again with your dad, right?
Correct.
And one of the things that came up with your dad over and over again was that he missed Dylan. Those were his words, right?
Yes, he did say that.
And you mentioned on direct, I believe, that you thought that it was just your dad trying to think of things that you wanted to hear, correct?
In a lot of our conversations, yes.
But you would been estranged from your dad for at least 10 years. Is that right? Is that what I heard on direct
Correct.
yesterday?
Correct.
You didn't really have much to hold it up against, right? You didn't have much to hold how he was acting in 2012 and early 2013 to anything because you hadn't been interacting with him. Is that right?
Correct. That's fair.
So when and part of your assessment was based on how he wasn't reacting in the way that you would. Is that right? That you thought you would have a different response, less stoic, if it was your child.
Yeah, that's how I feel.
But your dad did say, talked about how he had pictures of Dylan around in the house. Is that right?
I don't recall any comments about pictures in the house.
And were you ever in the house to see those pictures?
I was not.
Do you remember him saying things along the lines of, he's the love of my life, or my whole world revolves around my son?
He did make comments like that, yes.
And at one point, I'd gladly give my life so that he could have his. Remember your dad saying things like that?
I do remember that.
And he lamented that he and Elaine Hall could not put aside their differences to cooperate in finding Dylan. Do you remember him talking about that?
Yeah, we had several conversations like that.
And you're aware that he got a tattoo of Dylan's name on his arm, right?
I am aware of that.
And the way he talked about Dylan was that Dylan was a wonderful child. He was giving and funny, a good friend to his friends, and happy for the most part. Do you remember that?
Yes, sir.
And there was some discussion about the photographs. I think you referred to them as the porn pictures. Do you remember talking to Mark about that?
Yes, sir.
And he didn't fly into a violent rage, did he?
Not through. We were texting about that stuff, I believe.
Never had a conversation with him prior to June of 2013 about it on the phone?
I don't recall that conversation.
Prior to June 2013 or in June 2013, do you remember your dad worrying over fuses cut at his house? Section relevance?
Again, what's relevance to that?
This goes to the emotional response that Mr. Redwine's having, the fear he's experiencing, and gives more context for the reactions that that Nick Redwine noticed in him when they were having phone conversations prior to the end of June 2013.
I disagree. I think it's irrelevant.
There was mention of the discussion that it stood out to you where blunt force trauma was mentioned. You recall that part of the direct examination?
I do.
And you would agree that there were lots of discussions about what happened to Dylan, right?
Correct.
I mean, that's what you were calling about, was to get information about Dylan, right?
Correct.
And so that was an issue inserted into these conversations, and your father responded, right?
Correct.
And there was talk about how he could have been stabbed by a knife or shot or smashed in the head, right?
Correct.
And I know this isn't pleasant to talk about, but there was also a discussion of how there could have been a car accident, hit by a car, right?
Correct.
And the drunk drivers up in the area, that was discussed.
I don't remember drunk drivers specifically, but we did have those discussions.
Suffice to say that accident was discussed repeatedly.
Correct.
And bears, mountain lions, coyotes, abductions, all of those, right?
Correct.
Or that he tripped and fell and hurt himself, right?
Correct.
And you do recall is that that at one point you brought up plumbing pipes. Do you recall that?
I don't recall that.
You recall that in the discussion about blunt force trauma, pipes was referenced?
I don't recall pipes.
And do you remember your dad discussing the pain he felt around thinking about Dylan somewhere crying out for help and him not being able to respond?
He did make those comments.
There are, can you say how many recordings there are of conversations?
Objection, Your Honor.
I'm going to only inquire about the two that predate June.
Well, then, we can talk about the two that predated June.
Probably, we know the answer.
When you met with your dad at the casino in, was it late November 2012?
Correct.
There was discussion about, as you pointed out on direct, being out there searching, looking for Dylan, right?
Correct.
And your father would talk to you about how law enforcement told him, no, you need to stay here in case he calls, in case he comes back, or in case he comes
Objection.
home, right?
What's your objection?
Your Honor, this is specifically for the truth of the matter asserted. This is self-serving hearsay.
The purpose this is being introduced is to rebut the proposition that he didn't care and he didn't go out on searches, which has been presented throughout this trial. You're overruled.
You need me to repeat the question, sir?
Yes, sir.
Your father said, I wanted to be out looking for my son. I wanted to know what I could be doing to stay involved. But they kept telling me, no, you need to stay here in case he calls, in case he comes back, or in case he comes home. You recall that?
I do remember those conversations.
And you remember your dad saying exactly that.
Yes, sir.
And Corey agreed that he'd been told the same thing, right?
Yes, sir.
But what Corey said was that he snuck off, right? Didn't listen to the police when they instructed him.
Objection. Move to strike the last two comments and answers. Neither of those are indicative or probative of the topic.
Those are the only two questions I have on this specific topic, but it is probative in that multiple people were being told, don't interfere with law enforcement.
I'm going to sustain the objection. I think that actually came out through law enforcement, that that was a general rule. at least it's search and rescue, if I remember correctly.
Okay. I'll confine it then to,
Just, I think you need to confine it to things Mr. Redwine told Mr. Redwine.
sure. You remember that your dad said that he needed to be at the house and be available in case Dylan was trying to reach out to somebody, right?
I do remember
And
that.
that was something law enforcement wanted him to do.
Yes, sir.
And your dad said that he struggled with that, but he was going to comply, right?
He did.
You remember that your father at that casino meeting was talking about how he was having a hard time doing, like, functioning, that he was struggling to function.
He did say that.
And at that conversation, he talked about the worry that Dylan had got hit by a car.
I don't recall that.
Refresh your recollection to take a look at the transcript.
Yes, sir.
May I approach?
You may.
Page.
Yes, he did say that.
And in those early days, he was talking about how at first he was just thinking or hoping that maybe Dylan lost track of time or wasn't paying attention, right?
Yes, he did.
And you recall that at the casino meeting, your dad was talking about how he'd been trying to get away from work that required him to travel so much.
Objection.
So
This is prior to Dylan disappearing on November 19th.
the reason he wanted to get away from traveling so much was so that he could be home more for his child, but the prosecution has suggested Mr. Redwine didn't care about.
I am going to limit it to the time after Dylan disappeared. I think that's the appropriate time frame. I mean, there's been evidence that they did things together. They went on trips together just shortly before the Dylan's disappearance. So I think we're going to limit it to that.
So, with respect to after Dylan's disappearance, as discussed at the casino meeting, your dad was saying he was not doing a very good job or having a hard time taking care of himself.
Correct.
That he was getting very little sleep.
Correct.
That he was getting very little sleep because he was trying to rack his brain, trying to figure out anything that could help, right?
Yes.
And that he said, and please forgive my language here, but, quote, I'm on the verge of a fucking mental breakdown.
Correct.
Switching gears a little bit here, this is the conversation that you and your father had June 30th, 2013. This is right around the time of the vigil.
Objection. Beyond scope. Talked about this several times already.
Isn't this beyond the scope, Mr. Moran?
No, this is the discussion about the vigil that was raised by the prosecution on direct examination.
No, it was not. We talked about Mr. Brandon Redwine attending a vigil in February. There was never any discussions about other vigils after the 30th. Vigil in February was not, it was prior to the knowledge that Dylan had been deceased. This is a separate vigil.
I'm going to sustain that objection then.
Um,
Our earlier conversations?
Sure. Well, then with respect to the February vigil, you remember that that your father was received with hostility.
I didn't necessarily see a lot of hostility. You know, there were people that avoided Mark, but they just didn't want to go through that interaction, I guess.
You didn't see people glaring and throwing shoulders?
I did not know.
Do you remember after the February vigil talking about that with your dad?
About how he felt people were glaring at him.
and being pushy.
Objection, Judge. This is not probative of the purpose to rebut any allegations of indifference that Mr. Redwine's already testified about on his father's behalf.
Your Honor, if I may, the reason that's important is because there have been representations from the prosecution that Mr. Redwine wasn't participating in things, but when those things involved posting throwing shoulders and glaring and being hostile.
I'll let you ask the question.
Do you need to repeat the question?
Yes, please.
So there was hostility, at least that your father described to you.
Correct.
And it extended to people initiating physical contact with your father.
I don't remember any conversations about physical, like they were glaring at him is how he felt.
And jostling him and throwing shoulders, right?
Correct.
A moment, please. Thank you, sir. That's all I have, Your Honor.
Redirect. Thank you. You testified on direct examination that in those early days after Dylan disappeared, you were frustrated with Mr. Redwine because he wasn't doing anything. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you also described how he would talk a lot, but that you didn't see the follow-through. Is that correct?
That's correct. That was a lot of the frustration that I was having and just trying to figure out, like, we say it, but we don't do it.
Right. And when you met with him at the casino, as counsel has described, that was one of the purposes of the meeting for both you and for Corey, right?
Correct. We just wanted to get out there and do something. So we definitely had that conversation about let's make a plan.
And why did you feel like you needed to tell those things to Mr. Redwine, to Mark Redwine?
Your Honor, pardon me, sir. This is just retreading direct examination, so we would object as to asked and answered.
Okay, you're overruled. Go ahead.
Why did you feel like you needed to spur him or cajole him into doing something?
There just wasn't ever any action in, we could talk about something, but I remember having conversations. Mark had asked, what would I be doing? I'd stand on the rooftops, I'd be shouting, where is my son? Just try to get that figured out. And I had that conversation with Mark a lot, and just, we're saying it, we're just not doing it.
Objection, Your Honor. Move to strike. What somebody else would do in the circumstance doesn't have anything to do with Mr. Redwine's response.
Okay, you're overruled.
Is that part of why you encouraged him to appear on the Dr. Phil show?
That is just, that's something that we could reach millions of people, and that was a good opportunity to get the fact that Dylan was missing out there for the world to see.
And he was reluctant about it, right?
There was some resistance in it. Yeah.
And other times, things like appearing on a news show, those sorts of things, right? And we're talking, again, just specifically about this date range prior to June 27th. It was early days. Did you have to push him to do these activities?
We did, and that was a source of frustration because we're pushing to find his son, and obviously my brother, but we didn't feel like we ever got that reaction, like we have to do something.
And he even admitted that during the casino meeting, didn't he?
He did.
What sorts of things was he saying about his own inaction, if you recall?
What I recall is he felt that there was a lot of resistance from Elaine and how she was doing things, and it didn't match what Mark wanted to do. He wanted to do something. He just, again, never followed through with that. So we had a lot of conversations about we just have to get out there and do something. Elaine, she's doing her own thing. It doesn't mean you can't do your thing.
And counsel asked you a lot about sort of some of the things that he said about how he felt pain that Dylan was missing and worried, those sorts of things. did you see the expected emotions that would be appropriate or accompany that from your perspective?
No, from my perspective, we talked
Objection,
about.
speculation.
Just a second. Overruled.
Did you see the expected emotions that you would thought would come with those kinds of statements?
I did not. It felt like it was just said because we were expected to hear it.
And counsel asked you about this conversation on June 27th, where Mr. Redwine was talking about, as counsel stated, whether Dylan had been shot, stabbed, or smashed in the head, or other mechanisms could have caused his death. Did you see the expected emotion to go along with those concepts?
I did not. To me, if I'm talking about my son, somebody that I care about, I wouldn't just be saying trip and fall. There'd be some type of, I would have expected some type of emotional reaction, like sadness or anything like that.
Again, this is just hours after he found out that Dylan was dead.
Correct.
And counsel brought up the statements about blunt force trauma. Who is the person that brought up the concept first of blunt force trauma in your conversations with Mark Redwine?
That was Mark.
On June 27th.
That was Mark.
How many times did he say it?
I'd say about 4 or 5 times.
Thank you. No further questions.
Anything from the jury? Okay, can I see counsel just real quick? So, Mr. Redwine, you may be called back later in the trial. Because of that, you're still under the sequestration order, and one of the investigators from the prosecution will explain to you what that means. Okay. So, you can step down. But it means you can't stay in the courtroom. It's one of the things it means. You can't stay in the courtroom is one of the things it means. You have to leave the courtroom. And also talk to Mr. King about contact information. He's going to go outside with you also from the other side. Oh, wait. Bring that piece of paper back. That belongs to Mr. Moran. Thank you. Thank you, Aaron. Yeah. About a PDF. Okay, next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The people call Scott Eicher.
Up to witness stand, Mr. Eicher. Raise your right hand before you sit down. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do, Your Honor.
Thank you. Have a seat.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Could you please start by introducing yourself to the jury with your full name?
Yes, my first name is Scott. My last name is Eicher, E-I-C-H-E-R.
And, sir, are you currently retired?
I am retired, yes.
As of when?
2 months ago, actually.
Okay. Can you talk to the jury about your employment prior to that?
Yes, prior to retiring, I worked for a company called Hawk Analytics, which was, we taught law enforcement and prosecutors and attorneys how to analyze phone records and map that information out. And I worked for them for about 2.5 years. Prior to that, I was a special agent with the FBI, and I was there for 22 years. While I was in the FBI, I was part of the FBI's CAST team, which stands for Cellular Analysis Survey Team. So I worked for the CAST team in the FBI for about 10 years within the CAST team and 22 years in the FBI. Prior to that, I was a police officer and detective in Virginia.
So your work in CAST, was that ongoing in November of 2012?
Yes, sir, it was.
Can you talk to the jury a little bit about the training that went into your participation in the CAST unit at FBI?
Yes, I was one of the original CAST members. So it was a new unit formed in the FBI that we wanted to get to be experts in the field of cellular technology, mapping cellular networks. So as one of the original 10, we developed the training for the FBI. We got training from other law enforcement, the federal government. We actually got training from the cell phone companies themselves. So we built this unit, and then over the years we expanded that unit from 10 to, when I left the FBI, there was about 60 certified CAST agents within the FBI, and some of them were task force officers also. But during that time frame, we went through about 500 hours of training to become certified in cellular technology and mapping. As I said, we got that training from numerous different venues, even the private sector. And then we dealt with those phone records on a daily basis. So I was mapping, talking to the phone companies as new information came from the phone companies. We learned from the phone companies. We had yearly training while I was in the FBI on the new technology that was coming out.
And then which years do you recall when you started in CAST?
Oh, I was there about 10.5 years before I retired.
Okay. Where would that place it on the timeline?
It was probably 2010.
Okay. So you had been doing it for a few years prior to any work on this case?
That's correct.
And then you described ongoing training while you were in CAST. Did you have ongoing training when you went to Cellhawk Analytics as well?
Yes, I did. We were able to still talk with the phone companies to get questions answered about their records and stuff.
So while you're working with CAST and while you're working with Cellhawk Analytics, what did your daily time look like in terms of interpreting records?
Well, initially with CAST, it was an ancillary duty, so I was an investigator working cases. Then it eventually turned into that I was doing that full time. And then eventually I was actually teaching it to new CAST members within the FBI and then teaching it to other law enforcement later on at Hawk Analytics.
Were there particular programs that you were trained in that facilitated you in analyzing those phone records?
Yes, there were several different ones that we kind of developed. Some of them were simple Excel programs. Some of them were a little more advanced, like Gladiator, and a sub-program of that company was a program called ESPA. But basically, these were all just different programs that helped us easily and quickly, that's not a word, faster, how about that, analyze the records. Because initially we were doing it by hand. You would figure out the tower that was being used, be able to have to map the tower and map the direction of the sector. Programs helped us just do that faster. So if you're looking at 50,000 records, you didn't have to do one by hand every time. The program would do that for you. But we also validated our work by hand for the important tower chart cases.
So did phone records come to you from the phone company electronically?
Yes, they did.
And then are you able to take those records electronically and input them into the program, so kind of like you would GPS coordinates into Google Maps or something like that?
Something simple like that.
And then you would go to it, and if there was an important tower to the case, you would look by hand and validate that was accurate.
That's correct.
How many, were you doing this on a daily basis during these years in the past?
Yes, I've done hundreds of cases over the years, mapping out phone records. And sometimes these would go to court, sometimes they wouldn't go to court. Sometimes it's just find a fugitive, because we could use that data to help us locate a fugitive. I was doing cases 2 or 3 a day for years.
Okay. And in that context, have you been qualified as an expert in court before?
I have. I've qualified, I think this will be the 120th time I've testified as an expert.
Okay. And then how about, was it in different states since you worked for the FBI?
Yes, different states. I've testified, I don't know, probably 12 different states over the years: Alaska, Florida, Washington, D.C., mostly here in Colorado, because I was stationed here in the Denver office.
Okay. And then you talked a little bit about giving trainings through Cellhawk Analytics for law enforcement, prosecutors, et cetera. Did you also do that with the FBI and train and certify others?
I did. I trained and certified the CAST agents that were coming through, the rigorous training that we put them through. I also taught law enforcement and prosecution while I was in the FBI, and also did that while at Hawk Analytics. Thank you, sir.
This time I'd move to qualify Mr. Eicher as an expert in cellular data analysis and related location information.
Defense?
No objection.
He'll be so qualified.
So, Mr. Eicher, I'd like to talk to you about some general principles. I know some jurors probably know some of this stuff. I know some of this stuff, but fair to say you know a lot of this stuff. So let's go through some of these topics just as general background for the jury. How does cell phones operate? Is it similar to like a radio, for example?
It is. Cell phones operate on radio technology, so it's RF frequency that's transmitting that data from your phone to the tower, and the tower is transmitting its data to your phone. So radio frequency technology has been around for 150 years. We're using it in world wars. The advances over the years have changed from analog to digital, but it's still basically transmitting that data from the phone to the tower and back and forth.
Is that information recorded by phone companies?
Yes, some of the information. So there's a lot of stuff that happens in the background, some authentication information that goes back and forth between the phone and the tower, but sometimes it's not recorded by the network. But there's a lot of that is recorded, and different phone companies record and maintain stuff differently and for different amounts of time. There's no real rule or law that says the phone company has to keep this data for this amount of time or in that aspect. So we can get some information from some phone companies, some we can't get that same information from other phone companies. So it's kind of a mixed match of which company the phone was set up on and if it was roaming. So there's some data we can get from the phone companies and some that we can't. Not like, CSI, where at every point in time, where like on TV, you can see where that phone is at every minute or every second, or, get the content of the calls themselves. That's not real life. Real life is we're looking at historical stuff, what the phone company maintains, and what can we do with that data.
Okay. And they maintain that for their own internal purposes. They're able in law enforcement sometimes with a warrant to access it.
Yes, we have to get that information with a warrant from the phone company. In exigent situations, we can ask for that data and then follow it up with a court order if someone's life is in danger. Then we can get that data quickly, and then we just follow it up with a court order.
So if a phone is like a radio, how does it choose which tower to use?
So the phone itself is, as you guys probably know, nowadays these are very expensive and very intelligent devices. So what the phone is doing itself is basically it's scanning all the cell phone towers in the area that it can see. So it's seeing all the signals from all the surrounding towers, and it determines which signal has, which tower has the best signal at the exact time that it needs to make a phone call, and it chooses that tower to use to make a call or start a data session or send a text message. So the phone is constantly scanning. There's a list within the phone that says, okay, this is the best one right now. Okay, and a half a second later, it rescans and says, this one's now better. So as your phone is moving down the road, that's why they're mobile phones, they're constantly scanning to figure out which one has the best signal, and then keeps a list, and whenever a call comes in or you're making a call, it uses the one at the top of the list with the best signal.
In the physical world, where are these towers typically located?
Well, they can be located anywhere. As you might think of a cell phone tower as a big metal structure with antennas on the top, but they've gotten better with, communities kind of angered about the big mast towers in their neighborhood. So you'll see towers on the sides of buildings or antennas on the sides of buildings. I've seen them in a church steeple. I've seen them as a flagpole. So they're trying to hide those better, but they can put them just about anywhere.
What's the difference between urban areas and rural areas in terms of the number of towers?
Oh, there's a big difference. The urban areas, let's say Denver, I live in Aurora, so Denver metro area. There's a tower about every mile to 2 miles. So, and that's because of the amount of customers in that area. So, and I'm talking about the one company, say Verizon. There's a Verizon tower every mile to 2 miles apart. Now, the phone companies set them up themselves, so they determine where they want those towers, and each phone company is different. In a rural area, say Durango, or even in Bayfield and stuff like that, there's very minimal towers. There's not as many people. There's actually higher points where they can put up a cell phone tower that could cover a better area, and they don't need as many towers because of the amount of people and the terrain that's an issue in this area.
Can you talk about the issue that the terrain can present in terms of the ability for a cell phone to connect with a tower?
Yes. So terrain and obstructions plays a big part in the radio frequency travel. So your phone needs to see a cell phone tower to connect to it. Now, there could be some sort of blockage, a mountain, like we're here in Durango. Sometimes it's a large building that might change how strong that cell phone tower is in this direction, because there's a building in the way. Hills, mountains, and buildings all affect radio frequencies transmission. So terrain is a big effect in this situation.
And then ultimately we're going to talk about 2012, but to your knowledge, has a lot changed in terms of the number of towers between, say, 2012 and today?
No, not much.
Okay. So are towers added since then, or do you think that they're comparable?
Pretty much comparable, but what they'll do as the technologies change from 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, 6G is on its way. They've just put up different antennas, and the difference between all those generations of technology is the speed. Initially we could just make phone calls, then we were able to make limited text, and now we can send text with pictures. Now we can surf the internet very fast. So it's all the technology that's changed. Sometimes that requires the phone company to put another tower in the area. Most of the time they just add antennas and take away the old ones.
Okay. And then there's different phone companies, like providers, like, for example, Verizon, AT&T, et cetera, right?
Yes.
And are those the people that own the towers as well?
Well, the tower itself can be owned by a private company, not even a cell phone company. Some people that were very smart said, hey, this is a good place for a cell phone tower. I'm going to put up a cell phone, a structure here, and then you might have AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, all on the same tower. But that's the decision by the phone company themselves. If they want their antennas on the tower, if they want to pay someone else, or they'll build another tower right next to it that could be theirs. So it really just depends on area and what the phone company decides. They can be on the same tower, or they can actually just be close to each other.
And so is every cell phone carrier compatible with every tower? I don't know if that's a good question.
Yeah, I think I understand what do you want to rephrase it, or I can answer what I think you were asking.
If I have AT&T and Michael has Verizon and Christian has T-Mobile, can we all use every tower with those phones?
No. So there's some rules, and these rules are that, if I have a T-Mobile phone, my phone's going to initially search for for T-Mobile towers, okay? If it does find a T-Mobile tower, then it's going to try to use that tower. If my T-Mobile phone can't find the T-Mobile tower, then it goes to its roaming list, its roaming partners. Now, T-Mobile might have a partnership with AT&T in this area, or another company like ComNet, and we'll talk about ComNet later, but it's limited, so the phone can only use either its company or an agreed roaming partner.
So, Mr. Eicher, with that information as a background, can you talk about how you can use the tower information to locate where a cell phone has been?
I can. So what we get from the phone companies is date and time of the call or text message or a data session, and we get, who's calling who, the duration, and we also get the tower that was used to make that call. Additionally, we can get the side or the sector of that tower that was used. Most cell phone towers cover 360 degrees, and they divide that 360 into three equal sections of 120. So 120, 120, 120 makes 360. So we can tell most of the time that it used this tower and it used this side of the tower, so the phone had to be over in this direction, okay? But that's still kind of limited, right? We've got an area where the phone can be, but not a specific point. Now, this type of data, when we're looking at tower and sector information, gives us a general area off the side of that tower. We can't say the phone's at First and Main or on the third floor in the back bedroom of a house. Technology is not that way, especially when you're looking at historic work.
Okay. And when you do your CAST work, do you generate a report for CAST?
I do.
Is that typically a summary of the records that you've reviewed?
Yes, sir.
And are those records voluminous in terms of when you receive it from the phone company?
Yes.
Do you then pare it down to relevant information so that it's easier to understand and more presentable in court?
I do.
And then additionally, do you have some diagrams in that report that may be helpful for the jury just to explain some of these sector concepts you've just explained?
Yes, the diagrams and the maps are very helpful for the jury to understand where the tower is located, where significant addresses are.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time I'd ask to approach the People's Exhibits 48, 49, 50, and 51.
You may.
I'm also looking at approaches 42, 44, and 46.
Yes.
So, Mr. Eicher, have you had a chance to look at those?
Yes, sir.
Do you recognize 48, 49, 50, and 51 as segments of your CAST report that apply to different record analysis you did in this case?
Yes.
Are they fair and accurate?
Yes, they are.
And are they summaries of those records that you had talked about reviewing?
Yes.
And then have you seen 42, 44, and 46 before?
Yes, sir. These are discs that have the original data on it.
Okay. And is one of those, let me be specific, is 42 for Dylan Redwine's Verizon?
Yes.
Is 44 for Mark Redwine's AT&T record, so his personal phone? And is 46 from a ComNet tower that's in the area of Vallecito?
Yes.
Your Honor, pursuant to 902.11 and 803.6 with prior notice filed, I would move to admit 42, 44, and 46 into evidence at this time.
Mr. Moran?
No objection, thanks.
You're admitted.
And with regard to 48, 49, 50, and 51, I would move to admit as summaries of voluminous records into evidence at this time.
Mr. Moran?
No objection.
You're admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. So we were just talking about cell sectors, and I just want to give the jury a visual. Will People's 48 help with that?
Yes, it would.
May I publish, Your Honor?
You may.
Okay. Thanks. So on the screen, Mr. Eicher, we have what you've created this document, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Can you walk the jury through what this sample tower explains?
Yes, can I get up by the screen?
Yes, and I have a pointer for you, Steve. It may be up there.
You may.
Oh, thank you.
And Mr. Eicher, there's a microphone that you can pull out of the stand and so we can pick you up.
Yes, so this is part of my report, and one of the things that I'd like to do is show the jury, what a typical cell phone tower looks like. And what you have here is, antennas on top of the mast. A metal structure that has, electricity fibers coming off that tower, so they can send that information along to the cellular network. Now, the sectors themselves kind of gives you a visual here. As you can see at the top of the mast or the cell phone tower, there's kind of a triangle shaped cage. And that's so they can attach those antennas. So there's 1, 2, 3 on this side, there's a couple on this side, there's a couple on that side. So that's how they kind of direct those antennas in 3 different areas, covering 360 degrees, but we can also tell from the record that the phone uses this tower and say sector 1 facing this direction, or sector 2 facing this direction, or sector 3 facing that.
Okay. There's a second image on the second page. Does this explain sort of how that relates to the area where the cell phone might be being used?
It does, and so this is just kind of a aerial view of a typical cell phone tower. Say the tower itself is where it located exactly where that red dot is. And what we'll see from the records and the data is that the phone used this tower here and used either sector 1, indicating that the phone is somewhere over in this area, or sector 2 over in this area, or sector 3 over in that area. So we can be general on where the phone was. Can't be that specific if it's at this street at that intersection.
So you know more than just which tower the phone's closest to, but you have some directionality from where the phone is in relation to the tower.
That's correct.
And then the third page, you put another image. And does this just kind of explain some of what you talked about already?
Yeah, it is. Basically, when the phone companies set up those sectors, they align and then provide law enforcement not only the location of the cell phone tower itself by latitude and longitude, but they also give the center point of each sector. So in this case, the center point of sector 1, the one facing north, is at 0 degrees, so due north. And we know that the sector itself covers 120 degrees, so it's 60 degrees this way, 60 degrees this way, so that coverage area of that sector is about 120 degrees. These do overlap between sectors. So at a phone in this area here, could either use this sector or this sector. But it's basically saying the direction of each sector by a compass setting.
Thank you, sir. If you could take a seat. Before we get into the records themselves pertinent to this case, I'd like to ask you just about a few more concepts that may be helpful to the jury as we move through those records. So, sir, what is RTT data?
So RTT is data that term RTT comes from Verizon's network, and it stands for the real-time tracking tool or round-trip time. Verizon named it several different ways. But basically that is additional information other than sector that tells us how far that phone was from the tower. It gives us a distance in miles from the tower based on the time it takes for that radio signal to go from the tower to the phone and back. And it also gives us an estimated location of that device by latitude and longitude. Now, RTT data is not always available, especially if that phone roams onto another network. But with Verizon, when the phone's on the Verizon network, we have that data.
Okay. So sometimes available through Verizon, not available through every company?
Correct.
And if it's roaming on a different tower, you may not have it.
That's correct.
And then Vallecito itself, are you familiar with how many towers service the Vallecito, well, I'll just call it generally the Vallecito Reservoir area?
Yeah, there's just two up there. There's an AT&T tower and a ComNet tower.
Okay. And if we're talking about AT&T records and we're talking about Verizon records, are those towers going to service different records?
Yes.
Can you explain that to the jury, please?
So if it's a Verizon phone, what we'll see is that if there's not any Verizon towers in the area, like up in that area we were just talking about, the phone will roam on ComNet. Now, ComNet is a kind of a in the background company. What I mean is you don't hear about them. They're not like T-Mobile, Sprint, Verizon, the big networks. They have their own towers, and they're out there so other phone companies can roam on them in the rural areas. So there's an AT&T and a ComNet tower up there. So the Verizon phone will not, at that point in time, could not roam on AT&T with two different technologies, but could roam on the ComNet tower.
Okay. And then what would AT&T typically roam on?
AT&T will, if there's, it can roam on different phone companies depending on the geographical area.
Okay. But if there's an AT&T tower, the AT&T phone's not going to need to roam, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And these towers back in 2012, were they located right next to each other?
Yes.
So an AT&T phone is, because it's AT&T, going to go to the AT&T tower. But a Verizon phone is going to go to the ComNet tower.
That's correct.
Thank you, sir. And then could you talk just about the proximity of that tower to the Vallecito area and where it would actually service?
Yeah, it's just north of the reservoir, and it covers the town north of, and all the residents north of the reservoir. I think we have a picture later on I can show you, and also covers the reservoir area, but it's not going to cover down into Bayfield because of the terrain.
And similarly, the towers that are in Durango, for example, are those going to service up in Vallecito?
No. One, the distance is too large, and two, there's terrain issues. There's mountains in between.
So when we were talking about urban versus rural, this is going to qualify as one of those rural settings with very few towers.
That's correct.
And then Middle Mountain itself, are you familiar with the general geography of it?
I am.
And topography, I guess, is a better term?
I do.
What challenges is that going to present to whether a cellular phone can connect to the tower?
Oh, it does make a lot of difference. The towers that we're talking about, the AT&T and the ComNet, which are pretty close to them, each other, are on the west side of the mountain. So it faces, the antennas face the town itself, kind of north of the reservoir, south of the reservoir and the reservoir itself. But to the east of that tower is a mountain, a large mountain that goes high above the towers and then regresses on the other side.
So for us normal cell phone users, does that mean there just might not be good service there?
Yes, that's correct.
If there's not good service, is that indicating a lack of connection with the tower?
Yes.
And then you talked about roaming a little bit, but I want to get more specific with roaming. So if I understand it correctly, it's not roaming if a phone connects to its own tower.
That's correct. If it's connecting to the tower that the phone is subscribed to, T-Mobile to T-Mobile tower, that's not roaming.
But if it needs to access a different tower, that's going to be what we're referring to as roaming.
That's correct.
Now, when you have a device, a phone itself, if the device is off, do you get any kind of data that we're talking about?
No, if the phone is off, the network can't find the phone. There's no roaming. There's no updating. Nothing's going on.
And if a phone is on, does it necessarily create data that is logged by the phone company?
No, it doesn't. So one of the important things to remember when you're looking at phone records is that if there's no connections to the network, we don't know where the phone is. And those positive connections need to be either a voice call, a text message, or a data session. Now, there are some special circumstances, if you get to it quickly, that you can determine if a phone was roaming on another network before that data is deleted.
Okay. So I'm not being tracked right now by my phone because I'm not doing anything with it even though it's on.
That's correct.
But if I were to send a text here like I'm not supposed to while I'm doing a direct examination, is that going to trigger some of these things through the phone records in the phone company?
It will.
Okay. Or if I were to place a call, for example.
That's correct. Also, there might be, some data on the newer phones. You might have some applications that are touching the network, whether you're actually doing anything. You're not surfing the web, but your phone is running an application in the background that is making connections to the tower that can be in the records.
Okay. So in a minute when we talk to the jury about the records in this case, we're going to be talking about records that are generated in snapshots of time because the phone is either being used for a text, a phone call, a data session, something that's triggering either a connection to its own tower or roaming.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you, sir. So let's move on and jump into the work that you did in this case. So I think I talked about this already, but back in 2012, you were at that time working with FBI in CAF.
Yeah, I was a special agent with the FBI.
Were you asked to assist with the case in the Dylan Redwine as a missing child?
Yes.
When did you become involved in that case?
It was a couple of days after he was reported missing.
Is around November 24th or so. Does that sound about right?
Yes.
Okay. And what was your understanding of the case generally?
In general terms, we had gotten information that the child was missing, Dylan was missing, that he had come to visit his father in Vallecito area, and we needed to see what we could do to try to locate him based on phone records. So I was able to determine the phone number that he had through the investigators. They gave me the phone number, and I was able to obtain some records from Verizon for his phone, and then AT&T for his father's phone.
Okay. Did you know at the time that he was last seen with his father? I did. And so was it your goal to determine where his phone had been and where his father's phones had been?
Yes.
So in doing that, I'm going to give you a couple of phone numbers just to kind of talk about, and we've put the records in already, but as we put up sort of snapshots of that to assist the jury with understanding the summaries, is Dylan's cell phone number 970-903 and end in 5448.
Yes.
And then was Mark Redwine's phone was on AT&T, and is that 970-749-8032?
Yes.
And then did Mark Redwine also have a work cell phone?
Yes, he did.
Did you look at those records?
I did.
And were most of those records because of roaming activity captured on the ComNet tower itself?
Yes.
And did that cell phone number was that cell phone number 801-440-3756?
Yes, it was.
In terms of the bulk of the work or the bulk of the information you were able to collect, was that related to Dylan's 5448 number and Mark's personal 8032 number?
Yes.
And then did you additionally, we had People's Exhibit 46 there that I didn't talk too much about. Was People's 46 a tower information for that ComNet tower you talked about?
Yes, it is.
So when we talk about AT&T information, that's going to be pertinent to Mark Redwine's personal cellular phone.
Yes.
And is that tower information all captured within his own AT&T records, People's 44?
Yes.
But then when we talk about ComNet, is that going to capture some information that's additional in terms of his work cell phone and Dylan's phone from the roaming activity?
Yes.
And then when we have 42, that's Dylan's phone, then we'll have the records from Dylan's phone on there.
That's correct, on 42.
If we put these three things together, can you explain to the jury what you learned, we'll do it step by step, but what you learned about where those two individuals' devices traveled?
Yes.
And then I just wanted to ask you, what was it specifically that you asked ComNet for in the records request and received?
Well, I knew that Dylan's phone was a Verizon phone, and the Verizon towers, if it had those in the area, I later learned that there was no Verizon towers up near the reservoir and near his dad's house. So I went to ComNet and said, do you have any records that Dylan's phone roamed on the ComNet network? And they said yes, and they provided me that data.
Okay. And so taking all that data, was there a pertinent date range that you were most focused on for this purposes of this case?
Yeah, it was November 18th and 19th.
And then into the 20th as well?
Yes.
And then in terms of mapping, did you do the mapping for the 18th and the 19th based on the information that you had?
Yes.
And then in terms of the records themselves, were you able to look at the call records and the text records to just talk about general communications over the course of those 3 days too?
Yes.
One more concept I want to talk about before we get into those is pen registers. Do you know what a pen register is?
Yes, I do.
What is a pen register?
So a pen register is a court order that law enforcement can get to get information from the phone companies for a phone from a point in the future and then going on forward. So it's not historical stuff. It's you ask the phone company to give you data about the phone from the point that the court order says to the future, okay? So a pen register, we use those a lot in fugitive cases. If we determine that, this fugitive is now using this phone that he bought after he became a fugitive, now we can ask the phone company to give us who's calling. We actually see dates, times of the calls, the tower information that the phone was used. But that's future.
Right.
Perspective.
It's kind of real time, right?
Kind of real time.
Okay. And when you receive those, that's based on a warrant?
Yes.
Is that anything like a wiretap?
Wiretap has that same data in it, but in a wiretap, you actually can get the content of those messages or the voice for the phone calls.
Right.
This is not that.
So a pen register is basically just who's calling who and what towers are used.
You got it? Yes, sir.
But it's not listening in on what someone's doing or saying.
No. With the pen register, you can't get any content of text messages or the voice connections. All you're getting is who's calling who, duration, and tower information.
Now, what we're about to talk about is that historical data that you obtained after the fact, correct?
That's correct.
Were there some pen registers granted by the court later in this case?
Yes.
Anything meaningful come from that information?
No, it was several days. I don't know the exact date that the pen registers were signed, but we just wanted that information to see, who's Mark's calling at that point in time. This was several days after he went missing.
So in the pen registers, if they existed over time in the case, was there a challenge for using a pen register in the Vallecito area in terms of getting any meaningful location information from it?
Yeah, I mean, for location information, there's only two towers, a ComNet and an AT&T tower in that area, and all we could determine is the phone's using that tower and which sector it's using, unless he went down into Durango or into another area. But in that case, that was not the case.
Okay. And as we go into the phone records themselves, my last question about that tower before we start to talk about the locations is, the tower that services the Vallecito, is there a sector that goes north from Bayfield, basically?
Yes, from the tower, just north of the reservoir, there's a sector that faces north, which would cover the father's residence.
Okay. And that tower that covers the father's residence, is that the same sector that covers the father's residence as would cover Middle Mountain Road as well?
Yes.
So if you got location information that it was using that tower in that sector, would you be able to tell the difference between the Middle Mountain Road the residence or the Middle Mountain Road?
No.
All right, let's talk about People's 49. Your Honor, may I publish People's 49?
Yes.
So are you able to see the screen okay, Mr. Eicher, or you could use the exhibit itself if that's better? What's your preference?
I'd rather stand up by the screen if that's possible.
That's great, if the court agrees.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you. And so let's start here. Is this going to be you mapping Dylan Redwine's location information from his cell phone on November 18th of 2012?
Yes, sir, it is.
Pardon me, will you refer to these by slide number? That would be helpful.
This is the first page in the exhibit that I provided you on 49.
Thanks. Slide one.
Slide one. So, in terms of I can use PDF pages, counsel, if that's helpful. There's 8 pages to this exhibit. We're on page 1. So, Mr. Eicher, is it accurate to say that Dylan Redwine was actively using his phone on November 18th, 2012 for a period of time?
Yes.
And did that give you some location information as he traveled to the Durango area?
Yes, it did.
Can you talk the jury through the movement of his phone that day?
Yes, so this is, we're looking at a time frame from 5:48 to 5:57 on the evening of November 18th. And this is where and when Dylan's phone was actually using the Verizon network. And the Verizon network has towers here, and there's one driving down at a bit. There's some more towers down here. What we're seeing is all these red dots are towers, and then what we see with these arcs is that RTT that we were talking about. RTT. Sorry, the microphone seems to go in and out. And this is just a snapshot in time, as I said, from 5:48 to 5:59. And what we're seeing is the network measuring how far the phone is from each tower. So it's measuring from this tower, measuring from this tower, measuring from this tower. And where we see these arcs overlap is where that phone is. And this is about the same time that Dylan was arriving at the airport. So it makes sense that his phone's right in this area that the airport is.
Okay. And are you aware if he was using his phone earlier in the day, too, just from the records themselves?
Yes, sir, he was.
Does it sound right to you that his last voice call was at 2:29 p.m., but then that he continued to text with friends, et cetera, throughout the day?
That is correct.
All right. And now you've shown the jury how you can tell that he landed in Durango consistent with the location information. If we scroll down to the subsequent pages, can you walk them through more of the places he was?
Yes, I'll be glad to. So this is just a closer view of where those distance arcs overlap, and again, that's why I put that in front of the airport. So these are the, these are the RTT estimated latitudes and longitudes. Now, understand what I just said, estimated latitude and longitudes. Because it's the latitude and longitude doesn't mean it's GPS identified. It's measured by distance from towers. So this is just an approximation of where that phone was at these times. And again, this is 5:48 p.m. to 5:57 p.m. on November 18th, 2012, and the network says the phone's right here at the airport in several different areas. Obviously, he's not over here or over here. So you just have to take these as general areas of where the phone could be.
Moving to the 4th page. Can you read that?
Okay.
Can you continue to take the jury through where Dylan went based on the location information from the phone?
Yes, so this is from 6:43 p.m. to 7:12, okay, still on November 18th. And the phone's moved from the airport, which is down south over here, to the area of Durango. Now, we have a Walmart here in Durango, and we have the phone using this tower and the sector that's facing the Walmart. And we have some distance arcs showing the phone's in the general area of the Walmart. At one point in time, the phone was up here using this tower. It just shows that the phone moved from the airport to the town of Durango.
And then you put in boxes there. I know the print's really small for the jury, but they'll have it later. You put in boxes there that are white with a red top on them. You see those boxes?
Yes, sir.
Is each line, each sentence or line in that box one of the text messages that Dylan Redwine sent that day?
It is. And you'll see the phone number here, so that's the phone number of time, a name associated with that phone number. It's an incoming call or a text message. So it's a little confusing. It says incoming call, but it's actually SMS, short message service, which is actually a text message. So You see SMS, it's a text message, all of these are text messages except for this one, which is an outgoing call at 702.
And so these are all going to be communications that he's doing during this time frame right here, and you've located him in the same area over a course of multiple communications.
That's correct.
And so that'd be consistent, for example, with him being in the Durango Walmart for a while.
Yes.
And then can you just tell the jury the time frame that you've captured on this slide, the start and finish time?
6:43 to 7:12 p.m.
We'll move to the next page.
What have you documented in the next page?
This is the same time frame, 6:43 p.m. to 7:12, and these would be the estimated locations of Dylan's phone. And here's the Walmart. So again, putting him in the general area of the Walmart.
And now at this time, his phone's communicating with a tower in the Durango area?
Yes, so Verizon tower in the Durango area.
We move to page 6.
Did you summarize some of the general call patterns of Dylan Redwine in this?
Yes, I did.
Can you explain them to the jury, please?
Yes, we're just kind of giving you the last communications of Dylan's phone. What we saw, his voice calls, the last call was at 2:49. And then after that, all the voice calls were either routed calls or unknown type calls, which indicates the phone moved from the Verizon network to another network, or was not on a network at all. So what we'll see later on is that Dylan's phone used the ComNet tower up by his father chose.
So, and sticking with that first paragraph of information, so if his phone's not communicating with towers, would that be consistent, for example, with him being on an airplane?
That's correct. At one point in time, he had flown, the records show he had flown from Colorado Springs to Denver, and then from Denver to Birmingham.
Okay. And that was kind of earlier in the day before we landed, which is our exhibit.
That's correct.
And then you have more information down at the bottom of the text messages with communications with Ryan Nava. Can you just explain that?
Yes, the text message data from Verizon indicates that there were text messages back and forth from his friend Ryan Nava and his phone number during the evening of November 18th. And those continued all the way up to about 8:07. After 8:07, Dylan did not text anymore. Ryan sent him two other texts at 8:08 and 9:56 that Dylan did not answer those.
What was the implication of Ryan Nava sending him two texts that he didn't receive in terms of location information?
In those cases, we know that the phone used the ComNet network by his father's residence.
Okay. So if I'm not texting while I'm here, but someone sends me a text, is that going to create location information if my phone roams?
Yes.
And so to be perfectly clear, and we're going to talk about this in more detail after we're through with the mapping portion, but in terms of that 8:07 p.m. on November 18th, 2012, is that the last outgoing communication of any kind that you found from Dylan Redwine's cellular records?
Yes, that is the last call to include voice and text.
One of the jurors had previously asked a really good question about the last ping of Dylan's phone. Was there something like a ping from that 8:07 since he had used his cell phone?
Yeah, and let me kind of explain the word ping. It's kind of a general term that has been used kind of to cover many different things. You know, when we're talking about pings, it could be power usage. You know, the phone uses power and sector. It could be the RTP data that we're looking at. It could be any time when the phone connects to the network, a voice call, a text message, or a data session. But you can't just ping at any point in time historically. When we're getting into pen registers and pinging phones for fugitives, then it occurs every 15 minutes. But historically, going back, we only know where the phone is when there's a voice call, text message, or a data session.
So with regard to 8:07 p.m., Dylan Redwine's last outgoing communication from his cellular phone, let me scroll down actually. Is this map helpful in explaining the sector and tower that was accessed by his phone with that final communication?
Yes. what we know that Dylan's phone, and because there's no Verizon towers up here where his father's residence is, they used the ComNet tower, tower number 78, which has 3 different sectors to it, and one of those sectors actually covers his father's residence, which is just north of the tower and north of the lake.
And does this diagram show also why it would capture that Middle Mountain Road area too?
Yes, Middle Mountain Road kind of goes up. This is Middle Mountain Road here.
So all of this is the same sector on the same tower?
Yes. So the basic information here is that we have the phone using this tower and this sector north facing. We can't tell if the phone's at the house over here or on Middle Mountain Road.
Now I'm going to move back up slide 7 out of 8, and you were talking a little bit about ComNet. Can you explain what the roaming activity, so we talked about 8:07, right, p.m., Dylan's last outgoing anything, but you had talked about a couple incoming things that would have triggered roaming. Can you just explain that for the jury?
Yes, so just to refresh your memory, I went to ComNet that if you have any towers in the area and Dylan's phone, his father's phone roaming on that network at all. And I said, yes, Dylan's phone was roaming on the ComNet tower up there by his father's residence from 8:01 to 9:56 p.m. on November 15th. That tower is located just east of the Middle Mountain Road, as you saw on the picture. After 9:56, the phone was no longer roaming on that tower. So that could be because the phone was turned off, destroyed, ran out of battery. They also advised that because there was no calls on the roaming ComNet network, they couldn't tell me which sector of that tower was being used. So we know it used that tower, we just don't know which sector of that tower was being used.
So in terms of the last known activity that's going to give you location information, is that going to be 9:56 p.m. when you get that roaming on ComNet?
Yes.
And so you've already told the jury that at 8:07, Dylan Redwine was using the tower sector that would put him up by Aceto, either father's house, Middle Mountain, but consistent with the residence.
Yes.
At 9:56, what can you tell the jury about the last known location information for Dylan Redwine's phone?
All we know is that it was using that tower up north, that tower just south of the father's residence, the Aceto Tower, and one of those sectors, we just don't know which one.
So it's consistent again when his phone stopped roaming that he was up by his father's house?
Yes.
I'd like to move on to People's Exhibit 50. And Mr. Eicher, did this pertain to Mark Redwine's personal cell location information?
Yes, it did.
I'm going to start with the first page of this exhibit. This is going to be a 10-page exhibit that's from your cast report as well, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Can you start by telling the jury about this first slide?
Yes, so I requested that we get the records for Mark's personal cell phone. Again, that's an AT&T phone ending in 8032. And we requested records from November 17th through 23rd for calls, text messages, and data sessions.
Okay. What did you learn about his use of the phone on November 18th of 2012 and the associated location information?
So looking at the time frame of 5:44 to 5:48, the evening of November 18th, we see, like we expect, that Mark's phone is down by the Durango Airport. He's using a tower down here in a sector facing the airport. That's about the same time that he received a text message from Dylan that he's arrived at the airport.
Moving down to page 3, what do we have?
So the next section that we could map is the following day, November 19th. And we're looking at 8:42 to 10:15 in the morning.
So let's leave that slide up there because that's the next location information you had, but I want to talk to you for a second about why that is. So you talked about a 5:48 call that indicated he was by the airport, correct?
That's correct.
Did Mark Redwine use his phone anymore that night?
There was some data sessions later on that night, which puts his phone up in near his residence using that tower, that AT&T tower by his residence, and not on.
Okay. So let's talk about that in a second. But did he make any further voice calls from 5:48 until the next morning when you have your next flight up?
No, there's no more voice calls or text messages.
No text messages either?
Right.
And then with the data sessions, can you just explain to the jury, because we haven't talked a lot about that, but what is a data session?
So a data session is when your phone is transmitting information over the data side of the network versus the voice side of the network. And they've kind of intermixed over the years. Initially, the voice was the prominent one, but as you know, nowadays, most people don't call each other. They use text messages or an application or use a web service. And so a lot of the data nowadays is transmitted over the data side of the network. And in doing so, the phone company does log that information. Now, back in 2012, when we were looking at AT&T data sessions, there was some validity issues with that data. We saw on occasion that the tower information for data sessions could be incorrect, used for historical power. So initially, I didn't map those. But if we're looking at that data, you'll see that this phone actually used some data sessions that evening, the evening of the 18th into the 19th. This phone made data connections using that tower by its resident AT&T tower.
Is that going to have a similar sector that faces north and would include either Middle Mountain or the residence?
Yes, it would be the same tower on the northeastern sector.
Now, when data is collected, how can you tell if someone's accessing data by looking at the data records?
So what, especially with AT&T, and not all phone companies give us data information, but AT&T, you can see when a data session is running. It actually kind of shows you in the records that a data session is occurring, and you can tell if someone's actually manipulating the phone or if it's timing out and restarting. It's a little bit different on how the records look. So if you're actually punching the phone, you'll see a start time, an end time, and a duration that's, random. If there's a data session that's just running in the background, maybe an application that's running in the background, in AT&T records, if that application is continuing to run, they actually stop that data session every 60 minutes and 0 seconds. So 60 minutes, they'll stop that data session and start it again. It's kind of the network saying, hey, you've been on this data session, you're going to start and stop again. So in these records, you actually see like 9:10, 10:10, 11:10, 12:10, 1:10, all the way up to, I think, 9:10 in the morning. The data sessions are occurring, starting and stopping on the exact 60 second interval, or excuse me, 60 minute interval.
And I know there's a lot of records, but just to be accurate, you started at 9:10. Does it go to 8:10? Does that sound right?
That's correct.
And those are in 1 hour increments.
Yes, sir.
So as you review those records, is that indicating to you that no one's actually using the phone? It's just auto updating every hour?
That's correct. And this is, again, Mark's phone.
Right. So were there interruptions prior to 9:10 that indicated someone was on a device?
Yes.
And those interruptions, did those give you tower information?
Yes, it gave us tower information up in the nearest fiber system.
And those running updates, did those also give you tower information?
Yes, it did. Same area using the tower up by Spottless Residence.
Okay. And those, that's going to indicate that the phone's on?
Yes, the phone was on. It appeared to be being manipulated by the user.
So it could be in someone's pocket, could be sitting on the kitchen table, and based on this tower information, it could be at Vallecito residence or it could be up on Middle Mountain Road.
That's correct.
So what we do know is the phone was not being used, but it was on from at least 9:10 to 8:10.
Yeah, 9:10 at night, 8:10 in the morning on the next day.
And then we have some interruptions that are going to be somewhat consistent with what we're going to walk through on the 19th with the jury in terms of location information.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. So we're going to pick back up on page 3. Can you walk the jury through the first time that Mark Redwine uses the phone on November 19th in the morning?
Yes, this is a text message and voice calls between 8:42 in the morning. Again, this is on the 19th, 8:42 and 10 a.m. Now, the phone is moved from using the tower up here by his residence to using these towers down in Durango.
So at 8:10, we know he's still on the Vallecito North Sector Tower, but by 8:42, oh, you're pointing to something.
No, I was letting you.
Oh, great. Okay. But now at 8:42, that's going to change because he's coming south.
That's correct. 8:42 is using these towers down here.
All right. And you know from the records that these are actual communications he's using on the phone. These aren't just data sessions or something like that.
That's correct. These are voice calls and text messages.
Can you walk the jury through the travel of Mark Redwine's personal cell phone that morning on this slide?
Yes. Again, using towers here in the Durango area, there's, I know you guys can't read this, but there's dates and times where his phone connected to this tower and then this tower here.
So he appears to be moving south into Durango?
Yes. He cannot be up at his house and use these towers down here, so he's actually in Durango at the time of his phone.
I'm going to move to slide 4. Can you continue to show the jury the travel of Mark Redwine's personal cell phone?
Yes, this is actually the same slide, but just zoomed in a little bit further so you can actually see, some of the roads in Durango and the river coming through Durango here, and the same dates and times here. The tower used here, this tower here is used, and both sectors of this tower.
Slide 5.
So now we're looking at same day, November 19th, later in the morning, all the way up from, this is from 11:23 a.m. to 2:02 p.m. And we see it now it's going back up using this AT&T tower near his residence and the sector facing that road.
So this is consistent with him coming back up north from Durango to Vallecito again?
That's correct.
Okay. When you have the time here for the 2 o'clock one, how much information do you have about that location?
All we know is at 2 p.m., at 2:02 p.m., we know the phone used this tower in the north facing sector, which covers his residence and those other locations.
Let's continue the course of travel. I'll move to the next slide, 6. So can you talk to the jury just a little bit about the movement here of the cell phone?
Yes, this is a voice call at 2:24 p.m. And again, this phone used this tower just north of the reservoir, south of his father's residence, and used these 2 different sectors of that tower for that voice call.
So this would be an example of if someone's in a different area of Vallecito, you could tell just because of the sector.
That's correct. Sector facing north and the sector facing south.
And what
Southwest. Again, all these maps are north at the top, east, south, and west.
And what time frame does this take us through on this mapping?
This is just a call at 2:24 p.m.
This is page 7. Can you continue to explain to the jury the movement of the phone, please?
Yes, this is the text messages and some voice calls between 2:33 and 3:31, and then all the way to 3:47. So the phone used this north-facing sector at 2:33, and then continued to use that sector to 3:31, the one facing north, and then use this sector facing southwest at 3:47.
So between about 2:02 and 3:31, he's on the north sector, and then he's going to come south.
That's correct.
Just a zoomed-in explanation of those calls you were just talking about.
Yeah, this kind of helps you understand the terrain in the area. Again, those same calls from 11:23 a.m. to 3:47 p.m. And the tower here just north of the reservoir, up on the hill, and Middle Mountain Road is about right here. There's the father's residence. And you can see the terrain here to the east east and to the west.
Then we have slide 9. Is there more movement indicated here?
Yeah, this is from 4:22 p.m. to 5:02 p.m. You see the phone has moved from using this tower up by his father's residence, using these towers down here in Bayfield. There's numerous different connections during that time frame, some text messages, voice calls, mixed in.
Okay. And then, so this would be consistent with being down in town, basically?
Yes, sir.
And then, do you have a little more tower information because he's in town that's different from just a single Vallecito tower?
Yes, we just get more information, more towers.
All right. And then you mapped this up to 502, correct?
That's correct.
So down to the final slide, the 10th slide, what do we have here?
This is on the 20th of November, and we had 45 different calls and text messages from 7:19 in the morning to 8:11 in the morning, in the evening. And during that time, Mark's personal phone, the AT&T phone, again used this tower his residence.
Okay. And there's a big gap of time here because we skipped from about 5:02 on the 19th to finish off on the 20th, right?
That's correct.
But on the 20th, is it all north, or I see there's a couple of sectors there? Do you have?
Yeah, they used two different sectors during that time frame.
But only the Vallecito tower that day?
That's correct.
And then I want to turn your attention back to 5:02 p.m. on the 19th. Are there more calls and texts by Mark Redwine that evening?
Yes, and they all indicate that his phone was up here using this tower.
The north sector of the tower consistent with his residence?
That's correct, on the 19th.
So after 5:02, that would indicate he went north from Bayfield and was at the home from there on out?
Yes, at least in the area of home.
At least in the area. And some of those were at 5:16, as early as 5:16. So we know from about 5:16 on, he's in that northern sector somewhere.
That's correct.
I want to circle back to how late the phone was in use that night, but I want to finish the mapping first. So I'm going to turn your attention to People's Exhibit 51. And so this is a much shorter exhibit. It's a single page. Is this related to Mark Redwine's work cell phone?
It is. Again, his work cell phone, Mark Redwine's work cell phone, was actually a Verizon. So when it's in the area of Mark's residence, it's going to go from off that ComNet tower like Dylan stuff with. So we have a time frame here from 8:29 a.m. to 8:44 a.m. and then from 12:04 to 12:13, we know Mark's phone was in this general area of that cell phone tower. Again, we can't tell which sector.
Is it
Which sector?
Is this generally consistent with what we learned from his personal cell phone?
Yes, it is.
And is there just far less information able to be obtained from this cellular phone because of the amount of use?
That's correct.
Can you just explain to the jury, did he use this phone a lot?
No, there was hardly any data for this phone.
Okay. I want to turn your attention now. I'm going to take the exhibit down.
So are you going to get into a different area at this point?
Yes, Your Honor.
How long do you think you're going to be?
This would be a great stopping point. It'll be a little while.
Okay. Let's take a break then until 10:15, ladies and gentlemen. Please remember my admonition is not to talk to anybody or talk between yourselves about the case. So everybody rise for the jury, please. All right, we'll be in recess.
when I had, at times we would kind of go in and out, so I was trying to put closer. Testing. I'll give it a little more time. Yeah, there's not, no problem. Just yell at me and you can't hear me. It's a hard press. What time is it?